His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz, and I am your host. And our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. Welcome to our first episode of 2025. Today we're talking about a story that starts in Cold Spring Harbor but reaches around the world. We're talking about a movement of the early 20th century. It's going to get pretty dark because we're going to be talking about eugenics and the hold it had on the country and its connections to some pretty awful things, including Nazi Germany. But it's going to be okay because our guide has done his research and he's a familiar voice. He's today's once and future very special guest.
My name is Mark Torres. I'm an author and attorney, and I'm here to discuss my new book, Long Island and the Legacy of Eugenics, Station of Intolerance, which will be released on January 21st, 2025.
First of all, welcome back, Mark. It's great to talk to you again on another topic.
Thanks for having
me. And as we're recording this, and depending on when we release it, it's imminently. So like you're days away, right?
Yes, ramping up. I'm very excited to share this history with any who listen.
Now, when last we spoke, you had finished up, or we were talking about a previous book of yours on migrant labor camps on the East End. And I think you might have mentioned you were already on to this topic, but how did you come across this topic, which became your next book?
Well, initially, I first learned or kind of relearned eugenics. I think when I was young, I may have heard the term and kind of, just ignored it. But when I was actually researching with my wife on my second book, Adeline, a fictional crime novel, we were researching the mental health facilities throughout New York State, and we came across eugenics and eugenic sterilizations, and that kind of tied into one of those, let's save that in the bank and get back to it when I can. And once I've started to revisit my work from a history-based nonfiction, it was certainly the topic I wanted to revisit, and I was really taken away by the scope of the history. And although it's been written about, unlike my last book, it's never been told from the unique perspective of Long Island, which I found odd because, quite frankly, Long Island was the main headquarters in the global eugenics movement.
Yeah, no, and it's a lot of names will come up, and I'll just preface this by saying, as I was reading the book, a lot of it deals with some of the late 19th century, but the first, at least third of the 20th century. And I came to dread seeing anybody's name mentioned because I knew what was going to come next. So when you see the connections that you made, that will make sense. So let's define eugenics. It's like you, I'd seen the word, but it's not a definition I had readily in my head. So how would you describe what eugenics was?
Well, the word itself is literally described as born well, and that was coined by Francis Galton over in England. It's really the early 20th century pseudoscience premised on the racist and classist belief that undesirable traits that manifested in crime, disease, poverty, and degeneracy was hindering the pure race that the U.S. was destined to become. So the idea is if they can engineer perfect humans, if you will, that was the goal. The problem was, while that may sound aspirational, the danger came in what do you do with those who don't make the cut, who fall below that standard? And that's where the real danger of so-called negative eugenics really took root and became the large driver of this dark history.
Yeah, and it felt to me like it was like, and this is all pre, knowledge of DNA and really genetics. Like it was a really wrong turn in terms of trying to understand hereditary diseases and like you're saying, this bundled it up with a lot of other bad ideas.
And the idea is not new. It goes back to the Greek and Sanskrit texts. Can we make perfect children and not have disease? I mean, aspirationally, it sounds great. I mean, we'd all buy into that. But the problem was it was just completely assumptive. If two parents, if say the mother was a drinker and the father was the thief, they automatically assume that those were traits that were going to be passed down to the children, totally ignoring the socioeconomic and environmental factors that would have likely led to those situations. So it was really drawn on assumptions. And then the movement there was, well, we have the terminology and the condition. Now let's look to classify the millions of people they classified and then look to root them out.
What kept striking me, and as distasteful or just shocking was in terms of breeding, like bringing in sort of an agricultural aspect. Oh, we need to breed people to get the best, like a herd of cattle or something. Which the lack of empathy or human understanding, I don't know. How did you make sense of how people could believe this?
Yeah, well. That's broad sweeping. Certainly, it was intolerant, right? That's why I state that. Hence the title "Station of Intolerance." The idea that they could breed humans like they would with racehorses and sunflowers, and scientists really gravitated to this. And seemingly, the more complex it seemed to take, the more deference that the public would give, because who's going to challenge it? We're not biologists. We're not going to question the superior minded thinkers of the time. They must be onto something, and we're going to give way to that. So, in that regard, it was relatively easy, although maybe that's a little overbroad stroke, but it wasn't as difficult as it would seem to kind of win over the public. But the important point of this is that it wasn't some fringe quackery that people may think. It was literally the rage of the age. It was the cutting edge science that was going to, quote, save humanity. And it beyond science and medicine, all across the spectrum of the United States and in the country, bought into this. Religion, politics. Every president from Roosevelt to Herbert Hoover were openly endorsing eugenics. Supreme Court cases and justices, schools, over nearly 300 colleges in the U.S. taught at least one course on eugenics. Even religion had, they would have these contests for best sermons based on eugenics, and they would have these fitter family contests in the Midwest. It was just a wide sweeping movement, almost evangelical type movement that people all bought into. And again, who then would question the science that was built upon?
Right. And maybe to get into sort of like you're saying, a lot of institutions and scientists were putting their stamp on this, and to bring in, I guess, I don't know how you'd characterize him, but one of the lead names in the book, obviously, is Charles Benedict Davenport. What was his background? So as a man, he was a man of science, right?
Yes. Oh, no doubt. In fact, Davenport, he was born in Brooklyn, raised and lived on Long Island, Harvard educated, really a brilliant mind and a leading biologist in an era where biology made phenomenal advances, right? There's no mistake of his caliber and qualifications. But then kind of latched onto eugenics. And with that pedigree and that education and background, he was a mild, humble man, a family man, lived up by Cold Spring Harbor, kind of generally unassuming, a gentleman by all accounts. But with that education and background, it was hard to kind of refute or deny his requests, right? He would have access to all, and this is how eugenics really would be able to thrive. He would have unfettered access to all of the mental facilities, the jail systems. He would call the Museum of Natural History in New York City and ask for 2 Shinnecock Indian skulls, and they'd send it, no problem, we'll send it right over. He would go to a facility in Letchworth Village up in Rockland County and just have access to the records and the patients. And it was almost a carte blanche deference that was given to him and fellow eugenicists to promote this cutting edge science. And that was really what it was able to kind of springboard it into a larger foundational movement.
So just to stick on that, I guess. So what was he looking for as he was visiting, getting access to all these populations?
Well, that's a great question. And the interesting thing and we think of today of common insults, right? We hear the terms imbecile, idiot, moron, feeble-minded. Back then, 100 years ago, those are medical eugenic diagnoses. And there were different classifications, right? Low grade, high grade, they all varied. But the real dangerous term there was feeble-minded. And what that was, and he actually connected with a man named Henry Goddard, who was in New Jersey working at a school for feeble-minded children. And he also helped develop the IQ test that eventually kind of led to where we are today, sadly. And what they did there was combine disability, whether it be deformity or mental disability, with immorality. And when you put those together, it became hence the catch-all term feeble-minded. And once you were declared feeble-minded, they built up this huge database and stored all these records over at Cold Spring Harbor at the Eugenics Record Office. And they built that was the foundations of building this budding science. Look at the millions of people that were declared feeble-minded and below the grade, social defectives. They used Goddard's IQ test to test the U.S. military in 1917. And according to that test, half the U.S. military was declared a low-grade moron. So now what they did then is to the nation, do you see, this is why we need eugenics. Everything's failing. Our systems are failing. Our military, half of them are defective. If we don't do something, we're going to go into ruins.
Now, Just to go to the terms again, so this feeble, like these categorizations didn't come out of the field of psychology or other medicine. It was a eugenics system that they came up with terms that they would apply.
Yes. And look, obviously, the medical advances we have today to determine somebody with a disability that we may not know, right? Someone could not know you have autism until later and other conditions. Then it was, if you were a little off, a little slow, and eugenicists really excelled at looking at everything. They even studied sailors, right? When sailors would go out to sea for months on end, years on end, they came up with medical terms for that. They figured, well, something must be wrong with these people if they want to be out in the ocean all this time away from civilization. Meanwhile, that could just be their avocation or something they like to do, or maybe because that's the only way they can pay the bills. So every kind of occupation, craft, symptom was scrutinized and somehow made fit in one of these categories.
As we go throughout this, and this was evident in your previous book, you make a great use of visual materials, photos, and documents. So from what I gleaned as Davenport, and we can talk about his army of researchers, but they would create these charts. But when you look at them, they seem, I don't know, I wouldn't say childish maybe, but they didn't look very scientific. So like their father was, I don't know, laughed often in the presence of others, or, just very weird notations they're making in this quote unquote research.
Absolutely, and with these they call them the pedigree charts, and in fact in the book on the chapter I call it the pedigree hunters. They would dispatch an army of these research field agents to go to captive audience populations, prisons, psychiatric facilities, Native American reservations, Coney Island freak shows. They would go to these places with these questionnaires that were clearly biased and armed to continue building the data. They would ask questions, and if seemingly you got them wrong, you were marked negatively. Even if, for instance, if you were someone raised on a farm, they would ask you things about automobiles that you would have no business knowing about. And if you got them wrong, which you would, that you would be viewed negatively. And then with what they did with all this data, they stored them back at the Eugenics Record Office, again, building the foundation of the science, and then building on the next steps of what the plan was. And that's what, while I call it data collection, it sounds so kind of harmless, but really it was the original sinister motivation behind this whole history. You couldn't have a science unless you built the data around it, and that's what they did. And a lot of it was so assumptive and clearly, and that's the thing where someone like Davenport, and even his early supporters, Thomas Hunt Morgan, he was a researcher at Columbia University studying fruit flies. Now, fruit flies reproduce every 10 days, so they had the luxury of studying traits and genes, and they realized this is complex stuff. There's no way eugenics, what we're saying here, is wrong. So instead of just outwardly decrying it, Thomas Hunt Morgan just simply said, I'm going to step away, take my name off the letterhead, and I'll leave you guys alone. Even Henry Goddard later in his life regretted knowing that, eventually that what the science was false and wrong, and he regretted his part in it. But by then it was way too late, right? The seeds were more than planted.
So in terms of the game plan, and sinister, I think, is a good word. So they've got all this data about whatever percent of the population is feeble-minded. And what was the next step in their mind?
Well, let me just preview that with, in 1911, they had meetings between 1911 and 1914. The American Breeders Association of the Eugenics Group met in New York City, 45th Street, the City Club, and they had elaborate talks on what to do with what they deemed was the 10% or 15 million Americans. They called them the submerged 10th of the population they felt were defective and causing this havoc among society. And they had to be dealt with and rid of and targeted and eliminated is what the term was. So they came up with a 10-part plan. Education, and then it got to marriage restriction laws, and then ultimately to sterilization. And number 8 on that list was mass euthanasia. They contemplated wanting to kill 10% of the population in the United States. Frightening. And with that, so now that's really established a mandate and a blueprint of what they're going to do, right? So now they're building the science and the data. They have this blueprint. What's the next step? Let's create laws. Started with marriage restriction laws, which, and really took off in Virginia, the one-drop rule. Anyone non-Caucasian could not marry someone who was Caucasian. That passed. That was widely hailed as a success among the racist groups and the eugenicists, of course. But that wasn't enough. Well, then let's talk about segregation. Let's lock these people up during their breeding years so they can't have children. But even that wasn't good enough, certainly not fast enough, and it was costly because everything seemed to matter and it was cost prohibitive to them. The next goal ultimately was, let's create sterilization statutes where a state can declare someone this condition and forcefully sterilize them against their will. The problem, before 1927, there were about almost 4,000 sterilizations like that, eugenic sterilizations in the country. But it wasn't enough because a lot of these statutes are getting struck down by the Supreme Court, unconstitutional, cruel and unusual punishment, and so forth. They wanted a test case. 1927, it rolled around in Virginia, a young woman named Carrie Buck, who they declared feeble-minded along with her mother and her young daughter, who was just born. They totally fabricated the case, set it up and delivered it to the Supreme Court. And in an 8-1 decision in Buck v. Bell case in 1927, it was ruled that, yes, Virginia can sterilize this poor woman. And not only that, the decision, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes stated, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Basically, sterilize away. In the wake of that decision, 70,000 or more people were sterilized in this country against their will based on eugenics. Really frightening.
And in terms of the local stories. So in the institutions on Long Island, Kings Park, and the other institutions, there were sterilizations going on there as well.
Well, strangely enough, more than half the states had eugenic sterilization statutes, including New York. But New York was a very short-lived one. It only lasted 8 years. There were only believe it or not, there were only 14 recorded eugenic sterilizations in the state. And according to the records, none of them were compulsory. It was really signed by consent or whatnot. And Harry Laughlin, who was second in command at the Eugenics Record Office under Davenport, who was really a driving force behind the statutes, the model statutes, really lamented on New York. It set us back 10 years. And I was discussing and doing more research on why that was. What made New York so holding the line, if you will, where meanwhile California, which is an equally liberal state, sterilized the most people in the nation. The records only seem to indicate just that there wasn't enough support one way or another, because eugenics, remember, cut across political lines too. So it wasn't as if one party over the other had sway or not. It wasn't wranglings there, but there was a lot of clunkiness that really slowed up the process until, and there was a case going up like the Buck v. Bell case, it was Osborne v. New York. But once the statute was repealed, that case became moot and it never was heard.
So you mentioned Laughlin, and we want to get to him because he seems to be behind a lot of the. But so you mentioned he was a second in command. So tell us how Davenport got to Cold Spring Harbor, or how did that area grow up?
Well, Davenport, in my estimation, was the true architect behind it. He was the man of science, at least a man of science. But again, born and raised in the area. And he established several working relationships that really was able to get the program up. First and foremost, he had to get appointed by the Carnegie Institute, who in early 1902 was opening up a new facility at Cold Spring Harbor called the Carnegie Station of Experimental Evolution. And him and his wife really lobbied very, very hard to get the directorship there. And eventually he was appointed that. And then at that point, he established a very good friendship with Mary Harriman. Mrs. Harriman was the wife of Mr. E.H. Harriman, who was a wealthy, extremely wealthy railroad magnate. When he died, he left her an enormous fortune. And they talked, and they actually met through her daughter, who was taking a class that Davenport was teaching at Cold Spring Harbor. And there were discussions, and eventually she agreed and fully bought in, and she donated upwards of $300,000 and 80 acres of land to establish the facility and then build the Eugenics Record Office. Now, the building itself, it was a 2-story administrative building. It looked very unassuming. You wouldn't, it wasn't a scientific building. It was just this really elaborate facility that stored records, these specialized fireproof state-of-the-art cabinets, and all these millions of index cards were stored. But as unassuming as it was certainly the true fortress, if you will, of building it. Davenport also established that relationship earlier, I told you, with Henry Goddard. So, as Davenport's really building these relationships, he's in a sense building an empire, and he's building it on the fully funded, because all movements need money, fully funded program by the Carnegie Institute primarily, the Mary Harriman, and other lucrative donors. At the time, a lot of the wealthy progressives really bought into this as well, and they funded this and supported this wholeheartedly.
Was that Carnegie Institute, was that the first sort of scientific station in Cold Spring Harbor, or like what? Other than serendipity, or it's a nice location?
No, there was one right before that. I believe it was the Brooklyn Institute of Arts had actually opened up one, and Davenport was teaching there. That's why he kind of had the foot in. And when the Carnegie saw it, the area itself is beautiful. It's got a deep harbor. It used to be a whaling port. It's lush with flora and fauna. Perfect place to study, right? Biology. they would study fish and frogs and birds, and it was really an ideal location on that. And one of the things that Davenport did was early 1904, he took a trip to England with his wife. And the reason for that trip was, perhaps sightseeing, but more than that, he actually wanted to meet Francis Galton, and he did. And he explained to Francis Galton his plans to, quote, take Darwin far further than what his theories were. And Galton gave him a letter, in essence, sponsoring him and vouching for him, saying he is the guy that can lead this movement and, go for it. And that gave him enormous credibility in the budding field of eugenics, which was, like I said, pre-genetics. The scientists started to grasp onto these possibilities, and obviously it was, an interesting field, and what can it reap? So he really built all of this from funding to medical verbiage to even being positioned in the facility, and of course getting the sponsorship from a leading thinker of eugenics at the time. And eugenics was made in America, and no doubt, but it really was conceived in England. The ideas, the theories were espoused there, and once Davenport got hold of it with this formula and these relationships and this empire, that's where it took off.
And you document, you tell me the title, but he had his own publication that was also very influential, publishing research and espousing all these ideas internationally.
Eugenical News. And, I liken it to the Twitter of the time. And really, Laughlin was a big player on that as well. They both were part of the editorial review board. And what they did was took eugenics, because remember, eugenics had a global appeal and a global reach. Again, all inspired from here on Long Island and in America. And, whenever a new facility opened up or new research was conducted, they would send word back to the ERO, the Eugenics Record Office, and they would proudly promote this in their Eugenical News. It was like a quarterly publication, sometimes more frequent. And they would send it back out to the world, to the eugenical world and others. And it would give the here's what's happening, if you will, in our budding new field. And that was an important vessel that they used to kind of help promote. And it went as far as to the late 1930s, when the Nazis were already committing their atrocities. They were touting this and proud of it and pleased with the outcomes of some of these things. So it was a really instrumental way to propagandize them and promote the movement.
And it seems like, would you say eugenics sort of had the same success rate in at least some countries like Germany and I think Belgium, you mentioned? So, I mean, it was an idea that found root in a lot of different places.
Yeah, certainly. Canada, England, places you may not expect: Sweden, Denmark, Belgium, Germany. Absolutely, the numbers were there early on. And look, obviously the pinnacle of Nazi Germany, which I will get to shortly, I suppose. But again, the foundations were there, the inspirations were there, and it became sort of this global network. In 1929, Davenport led a delegation to Rome, to Italy. And they met at this, their thinking was, let's meet in the oldest city in the New World, and let's sit here and kind of play gods, right? What they did was they got all the eugenic leaders from around the world, and they sat in a room and they created a world atlas, an indicator, a locator, if you will, of the defective populations in each country. And it wasn't for benign reasons. Their goal was to target and eliminate these people in these respective countries. Can we make a perfect race? Yeah, let's get rid of the bad ones that we deem arbitrarily bad, and then that's the best way to do that. So if imagine this figurehead. If you think of the Wannsee Conference in World War II and the devise of the final solution, it was kind of a precursor to that, and the sentiment of that, and I'm still fascinated by that meeting alone. And I'm still doing further research on that beyond this to understand more of the intricacies of it. But that was the goal. Again, we're going to do it here in America, but now we're going to do it worldwide. So every country really tell us where and who, and those populations are going to be on the list, if you will.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's again, we've been saying sinister, it's chilling because all this documentation, like you're saying, in all these files, but the natural conclusion they came to is that these people shouldn't exist. And how do we make them not exist anymore, which is, again, chilling.
Yeah, frightening.
So we mentioned Laughlin just to give him his exposure. So it just explains how he entered the picture. And then what I'm fascinated with he became a star of Congress, kind of.
He did. Laughlin, it's interesting. He was hired by Davenport, and he had a reputation for being kind of a shoddy student, not known for his research. He studied onion bulbs and whatnot. And he was from Missouri, kind of an unassuming guy. But when he got there, he really became less a scientist and more of a mouthpiece, a political mouthpiece, almost an evangelical type mouthpiece to promote the movement, right? And at that point, you would say movement, not the science. And the reason why I say that is because you think about Laughlin was influential in the model sterilization laws. He was directly influential in the Buck v. Bell decision to get that nationwide sterilization upheld. He, as you said, he was directly involved in Congress. Obviously, at the time, there was extreme, and there still is extreme xenophobia in this country. And, back then, I mean, the southern border, if you will, was Ellis Island, and the Latino immigrants today were the Poles and Jewish and Italian and Irish immigrants that the white America detested, especially the elite, the progressives. They detested them, and they felt that was a large part. So eugenics did what it did with most movements. It kind of entangled and intertwined with that, connected with this anti-immigration movement. And they would lobby Congress, and eventually Laughlin himself was appointed a eugenics expert before Congress. And he testified several times. He devised elaborate charts, grossly racist, grossly misleading. And he really was a driving force to sway Congress to eventually passed the anti-immigration laws, 1924 and one prior, which radically restricted the level of immigrants coming into this country. In some cases, down as low as 3%.
Right, and like you're saying, eugenics was a tool that could be shaped to a lot of different policy, people that wanted this done, and then, oh, look, here's a list of all the people I don't want in are on the list of the bad people from this office. Just to stay in the darkness for a second, because we alluded to the Nazi Germany, but it seems a movement tailor-made, and obviously it was. You can explain how it was adapted or adopted as Hitler rose to power. But what are the connections that you would point to most directly from Cold Spring Harbor to Germany in the 30s, or earlier even, probably?
There were several, and it was earlier. A lot of the German eugenicists came to America, met at the ERO, studied with Davenport, for Davenport. The connections were early and often and clear. The only time there was a break, if you will, a break between that was, obviously World War I and the advent of World War I, the French and the issue that the Germans had with the French. They kept a little bit of separation, but the program kept going. And on two distinct fronts, the connections were clear between Long Island and Nazi Germany. So first, in 1936, Harry Laughlin was bestowed with an honorary degree in medicine by Heidelberg University in Germany. It was their 550th anniversary. Big event. Now, Laughlin gleefully accepted. He couldn't travel there, but he really was honored, privileged, and the book shows the correspondence and even the postcard with the Nazi swastikas on the right corner, kind of chilling. He accepted that. He was thrilled to have that. Now, the person who wrote him that letter was a man named Carl Schneider. Carl Schneider was, at that time, at least in part, he was the dean of Heidelberg University, but he was also a scientist and a eugenicist and a Nazi. And 3 years after that bestowing of the degree, Carl Schneider was behind the infamous T4 program. The T4 program was conducted in Germany pre-World War II, pre-hunting the Jews. They rounded up 70,000 men, women, and children, German citizens and those of occupied Germany who were deformed, disabled. They herded them up, took them to mass killing centers, and gassed them in mass. And, they fabricated death certificates and said, oh, sorry, your loved one died. They sent fake ashes and fake documents to the family. And think about that for a second. The idea of that method was obviously used later on in the Holocaust. It was in fact, it was often called the first Holocaust. Again, directly tied to eugenics and someone of Schneider's abilities and also connections back here on Long Island. Certainly the frightening connections were there. I know in 1936, Charles Davenport arranged for a delegation of Nazi eugenicists and scientists to come to Harvard University for their, I believe it was their 300th anniversary. And that was vastly underreported and certainly a big deal and a big problem. And, the other part about perhaps the most daunting of the connections is a man named Otto Verscher. Otto Verscher was a German geneticist, eugenicist. He was the counterpart to Charles Davenport. They were very close. In fact, Otto Verscher was on the editorial board of Eugenical News. Kind of gives you an indication how close they were in connection. Now, Otto Verscher, he initially started his work by studying twins and doing research similar to what they did at the ERO 10, 20 years earlier, data collection. But of course, he wanted to accelerate tremendously. Adolf Hitler praised him as one of the leading, quote, race hygienists in the country and in the world. And, he was really celebrated. Well, he wanted to accelerate his procedures and his methodologies and his teachings. So he hired a young assistant, and he sent that young assistant in 1939 to Auschwitz. And that young assistant was named Joseph Mengele, the infamous angel of death. And the book really describes at least some of the horrific experiments done in the name of science and eugenics to these poor innocent people. Really a frightening indictment. And that kind of, you're talking 1939, at that point, the Carnegies could no longer look away. The funding had to dry up. And that was one of the catalysts towards the fall of the ERO ultimately. But, you see the direct connections. And all along during these proceedings and these experiments, the Eugenica News continued to tout it and be proud and share it and saying they're doing the work of what should be done and, really touting German eugenics for their programs.
So I was looking forward to, because I knew you had a chapter called The Reckoning. So I was so angry reading this. I was waiting to see how, hopefully that some of these people got their comeuppance or, lived long enough to be ashamed of it. So what happened? Give us, if you can, the aftermath of Davenport and Laughlin. Did they live to regret their theories or?
No. Strangely enough, Davenport retired in around 1937. He stayed on board. He was forever the scientist. Believe it or not, a whale had washed up on the east coast of Long Island. And what he did was he wanted to boil the head to be able to preserve it and bring it back to open up what became the Whaling Museum. So even in his retirement, he'd written some books. He was doing this work. He caught a cold, pneumonia, and eventually died from that in 1944. Harry Laughlin, after the closing of the ERO in 1939, he retired, went back home. He eventually died. But what was later discovered about Laughlin, what was quite interesting, much of his work, it was almost as if they each picked out a disability. Let's target your specialty of the day. And Laughlin's was epilepsy. He targeted epileptics, and his goal was to root out epilepsy. It turns out that he himself was an epileptic. And, while he never had children, and we don't know if it's truly he practiced what he preached, but it's remarkable the level of hypocrisy of someone who has a condition condemning others for the same condition. While he's on the safe side of it, those many, many millions of others weren't. The era kind of closed. The movement itself faded into obscurity. Carnegie Institute forbade the use of eugenics anymore and said from this day forward, it will be genetics. And genetics kind of gave way. And by the 1960s, they kind of cracked the gene code and solved and understood exactly how it should be. And I assume we're still learning it to some degree.
And ironically, out of Cold Spring Harbor Lab, right, in part.
Yes, the Watson and others, and that led those really led the way for future understandings of genetics. And again, it really pointed out how futile and false eugenics was. The movement itself went underground. There was, after World War II and in the decades after, from the 50s, 60s, 70s, there was an uptick in mass sterilizations, not necessarily in the name of eugenics, but certainly rooted in the history and legacy of eugenics. And we see that in North Carolina, Virginia, the island of Puerto Rico, Native American reservations throughout the country, where up to a quarter of the population was sterilized. So, a lot of these things continued, and up until really modern times when, some of these states, California passed a reparations act where they gave some of the remaining victims money based on the horrors of what they had suffered. Sadly, there were only few victims left. There wasn't as many, but even modern times, right? Today, 31 states have statutes that allow for sterilizations under certain circumstances. It's certainly not based on the eugenic criteria it was, but it has that ability to open the door. The U.S. prison system is offering reduced sentences if inmates agree to get sterilized. In 2022, the Netherlands became the first country to allow doctors to euthanize patients. And again, this is under strict criteria, but the risks, the slippery slope, it's always a fear. 2023, FDA approved research for companies to develop artificial wombs that can be monitored from a smartphone. We're going to create perfect babies. Again, great idea, but what are the dangers of those who don't? And of course, let's be real. Who's going to be able to afford that technology, right?
Right. And who decides what constitutes perfection, right? Then you're mixing and matching your own criteria.
And I'll tell you one last point on this. Over 100 years ago, Charles Davenport wrote a letter to Madison Grant, a notorious racist, a lawyer. Grant was, he helped develop and build the Bronx Zoo. He helped save the trees in California. He was a conservationist, but he was also a very influential attorney and extreme racist. He wrote a book called the Passing of the Great Race, where he lamented the immigrants coming. So Davenport wrote a letter to Madison Grant, and in that letter he wrote, "Can we build the wall high enough to keep out these cheaper races?" And when you hear that line, you think of today's political rhetoric and the dangers of reproductive rights, certainly immigration and xenophobia. It's as if we're back to where we were 100 years ago and little has changed. And it's frightening to think about that. But when I see this in real time versus what I just studied and researched and put out a book on, it certainly gives pause.
What happened to all those pedigree charts, all those cases that you document, you have pictures of?
That was good. Right towards the end, between 1938 and before its closing in 1939, the Carnegie Institute finally had sent a group to inspect the records, if you will, at the ERO. Before that, it was never inspected. It was just trusted at face value. And a lot of them records were destroyed. A lot of them, some of them were preserved. I have some copies of that in the book. And they do at Cold Spring Harbor libraries do have a meticulous, ample supply of some of those records as well. So a lot of them some were preserved, a lot were destroyed, but they were all deemed worthless for the study of science.
So last thing, like I said up front, we're publishing this pretty close to your publication date. So looking across into February and the spring, what would you want people to know about where they can find you, where they can find the book, if they want to catch up with what you're doing?
Sure. For my work, you can visit my website, marktorresauthor.com. I often share on public social media many events. My first event scheduled for this Sunday, the 19th, is going to be hosted by the Nassau County Historical Society at the Jericho Library. And many of the events will be online, in person. I'm also going to be teaching at sharing this. I say teaching. I think that's proper because I don't view it as book talks, Chris. I view it as an educational, teachable moment. And I'm going to be speaking with attorneys at the Long Island Hispanic Bar Association and several universities and various fields, whether libraries, historical societies, colleges, lawyers, wherever they'll have me. I'm eager to share this history, understanding of the importance of it.
And a big thank you to Mark Torres for all the work he's done on his new book, uncovering and documenting and laying out the intricacies of the ERO. His book should be out by the time you hear this, so make sure you go out and find it. You can also check the links in our show notes for where Mark will be appearing, as well as some links to related resources. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org. This is episode 198, and fingers crossed we've got the path to 200 mapped out and a few more beyond, so we're hoping 2025 will be a productive year for us, but for everyone involved in researching and promoting Long Island history. So stay tuned. We're glad you're here. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And for now, but as always, thank you for listening.